So we're going to start over, okay? So, yeah. The importance for choice. We might repeat it from last time. We can't find where we ended last time. So, that Abraham went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, Lot with him into the south. And Abraham was very rich. I think we read this portion, right? So, yeah, we're going to move on. The main lesson of this section is wisdom for seeking spiritual rather than temporal good. That is illustrated on both sides. Prosperity attends Abraham and Lot while they think more for obeying God than for flocks and herds. Lot makes a mistake as far as this world is concerned when he chooses his place of abode for the sake of his material advantages. But the introductory verses, that is verse 1 to 4, suggests a question that seems to teach important lesson. Was Abram right in so soon leaving the land which God had led him going down to Egypt? Was that not taking the bait between his teeth? Had it been commanded to go to Canaan, should he not have stopped there, famine or no famine, till the same authority commanded him to leave the land? God had put him there. Should he not have trusted God to keep him alive in famine? The narrative seems to imply that his going to Egypt was a failure of faith. It gives no hint of a divine voice leading him thither. We do not hear that he built any altar beside his tent there, as he had done in the happier days of life by trust. His stay resulted in peril and in something very like lying, for which he had to bear the disgrace of being rebuked by idolater and having no word of excuse to offer. The great lesson of the whole section, indeed of Abraham's whole life, receives a fresh illustration from the stories thus understood, which preaches loudly that trust is a safety and well-being, and that it is always a sin, always a folly to leave Canaan, where God had put us, even if there be a famine, and to go down into Egypt, even if its harvest be abundant. But another lesson is also taught after the interruption of the Egyptian journey, Abraham to begin all his Canaan life over again, where emphatically the narrative puts it, that went to the place where his tent has been at the beginning, to the altar where he had made at the first. Yes, that's the only place for the man who has faltered and gone aside from the course of obedience. He must begin over again. The backsliding, you feel free to sit on the sofa if you feel more comfortable for you. Thank you. You sure? Okay. The backsliding Christian has to resort anew to the place of the penitent to come to Christ as he did the first for pardon. It's a solemn thought that years of obedience and heroisms for self-surrender may be so annihilated by some act of self-seeking distrust that the whole career has, as it were, to be begun anew from the word starting point. It's a blessed thought that however far and long we may have wandered, we can always return to the place where we were at the beginning, and there call on the name of the Lord. Note how we are taught here the great truth for the Old Testament, that outward prosperity follows most surely those who do not seek for it. Abraham's wealth has increased, yet his companion, Lot, has shared in the prosperity. It's because he went with Abraham that he had the flock, the herds, and tents. Of course, the connection between despising the world and possessing it is not as close in New Testament time, but even now, one foresees that the man who will be rich fall into a pit of poverty, and that is a heart set on higher things, which counts earthly advantages as second and not the first, wins the sufficiency of those most surety, fox-like cunning, wolf-like rapacity, and devil-like selfishness, which makes up a large portion of what the world calls greed business capacity, do not always secure the prize. But the real possession of earth and all its wealth depends today as much as ever it did in Abraham times on seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Only when we are Christ's are all things ours. They are ours not by the walk will of what the world calls ownership, but in proportion as we use them to the highest ends of helping us to grow in wisdom and Christ-likeness, in the measure in which we subordinate them to heavenly good, in the degree in which we employ them as a means of serving Christ. We can see the plight is best by not looking directly at the end, but somewhat away from them, and thus as a pleasure. If made the direct object of life ceases to be pleasure to the world's goods, if taking for our chief aim ceases to yield even the imperfect good which they can bestow. But now we have to look at the two dim figures which the remainder of this story present to us, which shine there in that far-off past. Types and instances of the two great classes into which men are divided. Abraham, the man of faith; Lot, the man of sense. Mark the conduct of the man of faith. Why should he, who has God's promise that all the land is his, squabble, am I right, with his kinsman about pasture and wells? The herdsman naturally would come to high words. The blows, especially and the willable land, was diminished by the claims of the Canaanite and the Perizzites. But the direct effect of Abraham's faith was to make him feel that the matter in dispute was too small to warrant a quarrel. A soul truly living in the contemplation of the future and filled with God's promises will never be eager to insist on his rights and not to stand on his dignity. And it will take too accurate a measure for the worth of things temporal to get into a heat about them. The clash of conflicting interests, the band blunt bred by them, seem infinitely small when we are up on the height for communion with God. An acre or two more or less of the grand land does not look all important when our vision of the city, which has foundations, is clear. So I elevate the calm, the sweet reasonableness will mark the man who truly lives by faith, and he will seek after the things that make for peace. Abraham could fight, as Old Testament morality permits, when occasion arose, as the Lord found out to his advantage before long. But he would not strive about such trifles. May we not venture to apply his words to churches or sects? They too, if they have faith strong, dominant, will not easily fall out with one another about the intrusions on each other's territory, especially in the presence, as at this day, of the common foe. When the Canaanite and the Perizzites are in the land, and unbelief in militant forms is arrayed against us, it is more than folly, it is a sin for brethren to be turning their weapons against each other. The common foe should make them stand shoulder to shoulder. Abraham's faith led too to the noble generosity of his proposal. The elder, the superior, gives the younger and the inferior the right of option, and is quite willing to take Lot's livings. Right or left, it matters not to him. God would be with him, whichever way he went. And the glories beyond for which he laid blazed too bright before his inward sight to let him be solicitors. Solicitors, where he was. I have learned, in whatsoever state I am therewith, to be content. It does not matter much what accommodation we have on shipboard when the voyage is too short. If our thoughts are stretching across the sea to the landing and home, and the welcome there, we shall not fight with our fellow passengers about our cabins or place at the table. And notice, what the rest comes when fate thus dwindles the worth of the momentary arrangements here. The less of our energies are consumed in asserting ourselves and scrambling for our rights, cutting in before other people, so as to get the best places for ourselves, the more we shall have to spare for the better things. The more we live in the future and leave God to order our ways, the more shall our souls be wrapped in perfect peace. Mark the conduct of the man of sense. We can fancy the two standing on the barren hills by Bethel, from one of which the travelers tell us there is precisely the view which Lot saw. He lifted up his greedy eyes, and there at his feet lay that strange Jordan Valley, with almost tropical richness, dark lines of foliage telling of abundant water, and the palm trees with Jericho pampas and the glittering cities. Up there among the hills there was a little tent, rocks and scanty herbage. Down below it was like the lost Eden, all the Egypt from which the hand but lately come. What need for hesitation? True, the plain were wicked, sinners before the Lord exceedingly, and the chapter says with grim emphasis. But Lot evidently never thought about that. He knew it, though, and ought to have thought about it. It was his sin that he was guarded in his choice only by considerations of temporal advantage. But his action to words, he says, grants for my sheep is more to me than fellowship with God and a good conscience. No doubt, he would have had shouts enough. I do not need to become like them, though I live among them. A man must look after his own interests. I can serve God down there as well as up here. Perhaps he even thought that he might be a missionary among those sinners. But his body did not seek first the kingdom of God, but the other things. We have seldom the choice put before us so dramatically and sharply, but it is as rarely presented to each. There is a shameless cynicism of the men who wildly only ask the question, will it pay? But there are subtler forms which affect us all. It's a standing temptation of Englishmen to apply a money standard to everything, to adopt the courses of action which the only recommendation is that they promote getting on in the world. Men who call themselves Christians select schools for the children, or profession for the boys, or marriages for the daughters, done in Sodom because it will give them a lift in life which they would not get up in the starred pastures and Bethel, with nobody but Abraham and his like to associate with. If the earnestness with which men pursue an end to be taken as any measures importance in their eyes, it certainly does not look much as if modern average Christian deep believed that it was of more moment to be united to God, to be growing like Him, than to secure a good large share for earthly possessions. Tried by the test of conduct, their faith in getting on is a great deal deeper than their faith in getting up. But if our religion does not make us put the world beneath our faith and count all things but loss that we may win Christ, we had better ask ourselves whether our religion is any better than Lot's, which was a second hand. It was much more imitation of Abraham than obedience to God. Lot teaches us that the material good may tempt and conquer, even after it has once been overcome. His early life had been heroic. In his young enthusiasm, he had thrown his portion with Abraham in his great venture. He had not been thinking of his flock when he left Haran. Probably, that I had just said, he was a good deal galvanized into imitation, but still he had chosen the better part. But now he has tired of a pilgrim's life. There are men who cut down the thorns in whom the seed is sown, but thorns are tenacious for life, are quick growing, and so they spread over the field to choke the seed. It's easier to take one bold step than to keep true through life to its spirit. Youth contemns, but too often middle age worships worldly success. The world tied its grapes as we grow older. A lot and demons teach us that it is hard to keep for a lifetime on the heights. Faith, strong and ever renewed by communion, can do it. Nothing else can. Law's history teaches what comes for setting the world first and God's kingdom second. For one thing, the association with it is sure to get closer. Lot begins with choosing the plain. Then he creeps a little nearer and pitches his tent towards Sodom. Next time we hear of him, he's living in the city and mixed up inextricably with his people. The first four steps leads on to connections unforeseen, from which the man would have shrunk in horror. If he had been told that he would make them, once on the incline, time and gravity will settle how far down we go. We shall see in subsequent sections how far Lot's own moral character suffered from his choice. But we may so far anticipate the future narrative as to point out that it affords a plain instance of the great truth and the sure way to lose the world, as well as our own souls, is to make it our first object. It would have been safe if we hadn't stopped up among the hills. The shadowy eastern kings who swooped down on the plain would never have went up there. But when we choose the world for our portion, we lay ourselves open to the full weight of all the blows which change and fortune can inflict. It comes voluntarily down from the impregnable fastness to the undefended open. Nor is this all, but the last, when the fair rain bursts on the doomed city, Lot has to leave all the wealth for which he has sacrificed conscience and peace, and escapes with a bare life. He suffers loss even if himself is saved and dragged through the fire. The world passes away, and the lust thereof. But he that does the will of God abideth forever. The riches which wax not old and need not be left when we leave all things beside are surely the treasures which the commonest reason dictates should be our chief aim. God is the true portion of the soul. If we have him, we have all. So let us seek him first, and with him all else is ours. Let's read on. Can you continue there?
Next chapter is Abram the Hebrew. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew. Genesis 14, verse 13. This is a singular designation of Abram as the Hebrew. Probably we have in its use here a trace of the customary epithet which he bore among the inhabitants of Canaan. Perhaps the presence of the name in this narrative may indicate the influence of some older account, traditional or written, which owed its authorship to some of them. At all events, this is the first appearance of the name in Scripture. As we all know, it has become that of the nation, but a Jew did not call himself a Hebrew, except in intercourse with foreigners. As in many other cases, the national name used by other nations was not that by which the people called themselves. Here, obviously, it is not a national name for the very good reason that there was no nation then. It is a personal epithet, or in plain English, a nickname. And it means, probably, as the ancient Greek translation of Genesis gives it, neither more nor less than the man from the other side, the man that had come across the water. Just as a medieval prince bore the sobriquet Ashramia, the man from beyond the sea, so Abram, to the aboriginal, or at least long-settled inhabitants of the country, was known simply as the foreigner, the man from the other side of the Jordan, or more probably of the great river Euphrates, the man from across the water. Now, that name may suggest, with a permissible and I hope not misleading place of fancy, just two things, which I seek now to press upon our hearts and consciousness. The one is as to how men become Christians. The other is as to how they look to other people when they are. Number one, men become Christians by a great immigration. Get thee out of thy father's house, and from thy country, and from thy kindred, was the command to Abram. And he became the heir to God's promises and the father of the faithful, because he did not hesitate a moment to make the plunge and to leave behind him all his past, his associations, his loves, much of his possessions, and in a very profound sense, his old self, and put a great impassable gulf between him and them all. Now, I'm not going to say anything so narrow or foolish as that the Christian life must always begin with a conscious and sudden change. But this I am quite sure of, that in the vast majority of cases of thoroughly and out religious men, there must be a conscious change, whether it has been diffused through months or years, or concentrated in one burning moment. There has been a beginning, whether it has been more like the dawn, or whether it has been like the kindling of a candle, the beginning of the flashing of the divine light into the heart. And the men that are most really under the influence of religious truth can, as a rule, looking back upon their past experience, see that it divides itself into two halves, separated from each other by a profound gulf. The time on the other side, and that on this side of the great river. We must take heed lest by insisting on any one way of entrance into the kingdom we seem to narrow God's mercy, or sadden true hearts, or make the method of approach a test of the fact of entrance. God's city has more than 12 gates. They open to all the 32 points of the compass. Yet there is, in the religious experience of the truest saints, always something analogous to this change. And what I desire to press upon you is that unless you are only religious people after the popular superficial fashion of the day, there will be something like it in your lives. There will be a change in a man's deepest self, so that he will be a new creature with new tastes, new motives stirring to action, new desires pressing for satisfaction, new loves sweetly filling his heart, new insight into the meanings and true good of life and time guiding his conduct, new aversions withdrawing him from old delights, which have become hateful now, new hopes plumbing their growing wings, and new powers bearing him along a new road. There will be a change in his relations to God and to God's will. God in Christ will have become a center instead of self, which was so before. He lives in a new world, being himself a new man. Our Lord uses this very illustration when he says, He that heareth my word and believeth him that sent me hath eternal life, and cometh not into judgment, but hath passed out of death into life. That is a great migration, is it not, from the condition of a corpse to that of a living man? Paul, too, gives the same idea with a somewhat different turn of the illustration when he gives thanks to the Father who delivered us out of the power of darkness and translated us into the kingdom of, not as we might expect to complete the antithesis, the light, but the kingdom of the Son of his love, which is the same thing as the light. The illustration is probably drawn from the practice of the ancient conquering monarchs who, when they subjugated a country, were wont to lead away captive long files of its inhabitants as compulsory colonists and set them down in another land. Thus the conquering Christian comes, and those whom he conquers by his love, he shifts by a great immigration. Thus the conquering Christ comes, and those whom he conquers by his love, he shifts by a great immigration out of the dominion of the darkness which is at once tyranny and anarchy, and leads them into the happy kingdom of the light. Thus, then, all Christian men become such, because they turn their backs upon their old selves and crucify their affections and lusts, and paste down the leaf, as it were, on which their blotted past is writ, and turn over a new and fairer one. And my question to you, dear brethren, is, are you men from the other side, who are not born where you live now?
Are you a Hebrew?
Very much.
Yeah.
And who have passed out of the native Chaldea into the foreign, and yet to the new self-home, land of union with God. Number 2, this designation may be taken as teaching that a Christian should be known as a foreigner, a man from across the water.
Ah, I think about my life. I'm a man across water, literally. Cross Pacific, man. Literally. Literally cross Pacific, you know. I remember the early days, sorry to break the mode here. The Lord said, someday you're going to go to the west side of America and you're going to look at your homeland and across the Pacific. Can you believe that?
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. And then he moved out to the northwest, so the very tip of it. Yeah, so it's crazy. The city I was in, it's also at the tip of the peninsula. So here's a peninsula at the tip as well, so a little bit crazy. Excuse me, sorry. Go ahead.
Everybody in Canaan that knew Abram at all knew him as not one of themselves. The Hebrew was the name he went by, because his unlikeness to the others was the most conspicuous thing about him, even to the shallowest eye. Abram found himself, when he had migrated to Canaan, in no barbarous country, but plunged at once into the midst of an organized and compact civilization that walled its cities and had the comforts and conveniences and regularities of a settled order. And in the midst of it all, what did he do? He elected to live in a tent. He dwelt in tabernacles, as the epistle to the Hebrew comments upon his history, because he looked for a city. The more his expectations were fixed upon a permanent abode, the more transitory did he make his abode here. If there had been no other city to fill his eyes, he would have gone and lived in some of those that were in the land. If there had been no other order to which he felt himself to belong, he would have had no objection to cast in his lot with the order and the people with whom he lived on friendly terms. But although he bought and sold with them, and fought for them and by their sides, and acquired from them land in which to bury his dead, he was not one of them, but said, "No, I'm not going into your city. I stay in my tent under this terebinth tree, for I am here as a stranger and a sojourner." No doubt there were differences of language, dress, and 100 other little things which helped the impression made on men in the land by the strange visitor who lived in amity but in separation, and they were all crystallized in the name which the popular voice gave him, the man from the other side.
Man from the other side.
That is the impression which Christian people ought to make in the world. They should be recognized by even unobservant eyes who know nothing of the inner secret of their lives as plainly belonging to another order. If we seek to keep fresh in our own minds the consciousness that we do so, it will make itself manifest in all our bearing and actions. So that exhortation to cultivate the continual sense that our true city, the mother city of our hearts and hopes, is in heaven is ever to be reiterated, and as constantly obeyed as the necessary condition of a life worthy of our true affinities and of our glorious hopes. Nor less needful is the other exhortation. Live by the laws of your own land, not by those of the foreign country where you are for a time. If you do that thoroughly, you will not need to say, "I am from another country." Your conduct will say it for you. An English ship is a bit of England, in whatever latitude it may be, and however far beyond the 3-mile limit of the king's authority upon the seas it may float. And so, wherever there is a Christian man, there is a bit of God's kingdom. And over that little speck in the midst of the ocean of the world, the flag with the cross on it should fly, and the laws of the Christ should be the only laws that have currency. If it could be said of us, as Haman said to his king about the Jews, that we were a people with laws diverse from those of all people, we should be doing more than, alas, most of us do, to honor him whom we profess to serve. Follow Christ, and people will be quick enough to say of you, the man from the other side. He does not belong to our city. There is no need for ostentation, nor for saying, come and see my zeal for the Lord, nor for blowing trumpets before us at street corners or elsewhere. The less of all that, the better. The more we try to do the common things done by the folk around us, but from another motive, the more powerful will be our witness for our master. For instance, when John Knox was in the French galleys, he was fastened to the same oar with some criminal, perhaps a murderer. The two men sat on the same bench, did the same work, tugged at the same heavy sweep, were fed with the same food, suffered the same sorrows. Do you think there was any doubt as to the infinite gulf between them? We may be working side by side at the very same tasks and under similar circumstances with men that have no share in our faith, and no sympathy with our hopes and aspirations. And yet, though doing the same thing, it will not be the same thing.
It will not be the same thing.
And if we keep Christ before us and follow his steps, who has left us an example, depend upon it, people will very soon find out that we are men from across the water. Notice further how this dissimilarity and obvious aloofness from the order of things in which we dwell is still perfectly compatible with all sorts of helpful associations. The context shows us that. There had come a flood of invasion under kings with strange and barbarous names from the Far East. They had swept down upon the fertile valley of Siddim, and there had inflicted devastation. Amongst the captives had been Lot, Abram's relative, and all his goods had been taken. One fugitive, as it appears, had escaped, and the first thing he did was go straight to the man from the other side, and tell him about it, as if sure of sympathy and help. No doubt the relationship between Abram and Lot was the main reason why the panting survivor made his way to the hills where Abram's tent was pitched. But there was also confidence in his willingness to help the Sodomites who had lost their goods. So it was not to the sons of Heth and Mamre that the fugitive turned in his extremity, but he told Abram the Hebrew. I need not narrate over again the familiar story of how, for once in his peaceful life, the friend of God girds on his sword and develops military instincts in his prompt and well-planned pursuit, which show that if he did not try to conquer some part of the land which he knew to be his by the will of God, it was not for want of ability, but because he believed God and could wait. We all know how he armed his slaves and made a swift march to the northern extremity of the land, and then by a nocturnal surprise came down upon the marauders and scattered them like chaff before his onset, and had recovered Lot and all the spoil. Let us learn that if Christian men will live well apart from the world, they will be able to sympathize with and help the world, and that our religion should fit us for the prompt and heroic undertaking, as it certainly does for the successful accomplishment of all deeds of brotherly kindness and sympathy, bringing help and solace to the weak and the wearied, liberty to the captives, and hope to the despairing. I do not believe that Christian men have any business to draw swords now. Abram is in that respect the Old Testament type of a God-fearing hero, with the actual sword in his hands. The New Testament type of a Christian warrior without the sword is not one jot less, but more heroic. The form of sympathy, help, and public spirit which the man from the other side displayed is worse than an anachronism now in the light of Christ's law. It is a contradiction. But the spirit which breathed through Abram's conduct should be ours. We are bound to seek the peace of the city, where we dwell as strangers and pilgrims, avoiding no duty of sympathy and help, but by prompt, heroic, self-forgetting service to all the needy, sorrowful, and oppressed, building up such characters for ourselves that fugitives and desperate men shall instinctively turn to men from the other side, for which they know full well the men of the country are too selfish or cowardly to give. May I venture to suggest yet another and very different application of this name? To the aboriginal inhabitants of heaven, the angels that kept their first estate, redeemed men, are possessors of a unique experience. They are the men from the other side. They who entered on their pilgrimage the Red Sea of conversion, pass out of it through the Jordan of death. They who become Christ by the great change of yielding their hearts to him, and who live here as pilgrims and sojourners, pass dry-shod through the stream into his presence. And there they who have always dwelt in the sunny highlands of the true Canaan gather around them and call them, not unenvying, perhaps, their experience, the men that have crossed. The Hebrews of the Hebrews in the heavens are those who have known what it is to be pilgrims and sojourners, and to whom the promise has been fulfilled in the last hour of their journey. When thou passest through the river, I will be with thee. They teach the angels a new song, who sing, Thou hast led us through fire and through water, and brought us into a wealthy place.
Bless the Lord. Yes. This is a wonderful author, right? So,
Yeah.
have beautiful insight.